What if the name on a job application could stop a billionaire's entire day? What if one line of handwriting could unlock a secret buried for almost 20 years? If stories like this move you, hit that like button right now, type kindness in the comments, and subscribe before we go any further. You will not want to miss where this goes. The morning air was cold and gray over Cedar Bay when Daniel Reyes pulled his old truck into a parking spot outside a tall glass office building. The engine coughed twice before it finally went silent. In the back seat, his 10-year-old daughter, Mia, was tying her shoelaces slowly, in no hurry at all. "You're going to miss the bell," Daniel said, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. "5 more seconds," Mia answered, grinning. He smiled despite everything weighing on his mind. Mia grabbed her backpack, the same one with a patch sewn over the corner where it had torn last winter, and hopped out. Daniel walked her to the school gate, waited until she disappeared through the doors, and then stood there a moment longer than necessary. It was the only part of his day that still felt normal. 3 weeks earlier, his life had changed in a single phone call. The construction company where he had worked for almost 13 years had lost its biggest client. Layoffs came fast. Daniel had packed up his tools, said goodbye to co-workers who had become like family, and driven home not knowing how he would explain it to his daughter. At first, he believed he would find something within days. He had experience. He had a strong work ethic. He had references. But days turned into a week, and a week turned into 3. Every interview ended with the same polite sentence. "We'll keep your information on file." Nobody called back. Bills didn't pause to wait for good news. Rent was due. The car needed a repair he couldn't afford. And his father, who lived a few streets away, had a heart condition that required medication every single month. Daniel had promised himself he would never let his pride get in the way of taking care of his family. So that morning, he drove toward Harmon Group, one of the largest property and real estate companies on the coast, because their website listed one simple opening, a janitorial position, full-time, with benefits after 90 days. The building was enormous, a tower of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds. Employees walked briskly across the lobby floor, carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, deep in conversation about numbers and deadlines that Daniel couldn't begin to imagine. He looked down at his jacket, the sleeves a little frayed at the cuffs, and for a second, he almost turned back toward the door. Instead, he took a breath and walked to the front desk. "Here for the janitorial application," he said quietly. The receptionist barely looked up. She slid a clipboard across the counter without a word, then pointed toward a row of chairs where a few other applicants were already waiting. One looked barely out of his teens. Another wore boots so new they still had the store shine on them. Daniel sat down, uncapped his pen, and began filling out the form. Name. Address. Previous employer. Emergency contact. Education. References. Then came a line asking for his full legal name, not just the name he went by. He paused for only a second before writing it carefully. Daniel Elias Reyes. He returned the clipboard to the receptionist, thanked her, and stood to leave. That's when a young man in a company vest jogged over to catch him. "Sir, wait, the building's facilities director wants to meet a few applicants today, if you have a few minutes." Daniel almost laughed at the idea that time was something he lacked. "I have all the time in the world," he said. He was led to a small waiting area with a wide window overlooking the harbor. Boats rocked gently against the docks. Seagulls circled above the water. He watched them for almost 20 minutes before a stocky man in his 50s finally walked in, reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Daniel Reyes?" the man asked, extending a hand. "I'm Walter Combs, facilities director." They shook hands and sat down. Walter flipped through Daniel's application, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "You've done a lot more than janitorial work," he said. "Why apply here?" "Because I need steady work," Daniel answered honestly. Simple as that. Walter nodded slowly, as if he had heard that answer more times than he could count, and respected it every time. The interview lasted about 15 minutes. Questions about scheduling, safety procedures, night shifts, nothing out of the ordinary. As Daniel stood to leave, Walter shook his hand again. "We'll be making decisions by the end of the week," he said. Daniel thanked him and walked back out into the sunlight, already thinking about the next application he needed to drop off across town. Hope, he had learned, could not afford to sit still. High above the lobby, on the top floor of the building, the CEO of Harmon Group was going through a stack of folders before her afternoon board meeting. Her name was Alina Cross, and from her office window she could see the entire harbor stretched out beneath her, the same boats Daniel had been watching from 2 floors below. She rarely noticed the view anymore. Her mind was usually somewhere else entirely, buried in numbers, deadlines, and decisions that affected thousands of employees across the region. Her assistant walked in holding a stack of folders that needed her signature. "Human Resources needs these back today," she said, setting them on the desk. Alina picked up her pen and began working through them quickly. New hire approvals, internship requests, standard paperwork. Then her hand stopped moving. She stared at one line on one page for a long moment. Her assistant noticed the pause. "Is everything all right?" Alina didn't answer right away. She read the name again. Daniel Reyes. The room felt strangely still. She looked toward the window, toward the fog slowly lifting off the water, and whispered almost without meaning to. "It can't be the same person." "Do you know him?" her assistant asked. "I knew a family with that name," Alina said quietly. "A long time ago." She hadn't heard that name in almost 20 years, not since a rainy afternoon that had quietly reshaped the entire direction of her life. She closed the folder and looked up. "Can you ask HR to hold this application? Don't process it yet." "Is there a problem?" "No," she said. "I just want to meet this applicant myself. Personally." Her assistant blinked in surprise. It was, after all, just an application for a janitorial position. But Alina had already made up her mind. Meanwhile, Daniel drove home with no idea that a single line of handwriting had just interrupted one of the busiest mornings of one of the wealthiest women on the entire coast. He assumed his application would end up like all the others, buried somewhere in a filing cabinet, forgotten within a week. At home, he found Mia sitting on the front steps of their apartment building, helping an elderly neighbor untangle a ball of yarn that had rolled across the sidewalk. He smiled quietly and carried the groceries inside. On the refrigerator, held up by a small magnet shaped like a lighthouse, was a red overdue notice he hadn't been able to bring himself to remove. He looked at it for a moment, then turned to start dinner. Across town, in a quiet office lit by the last light of the afternoon, Alina Cross opened an old wooden box she hadn't touched in years, searching for something connected to a name she never thought she would see again. If this story is pulling at your heart, take just 2 seconds to smash that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps this story reach more people who need a little hope today. Now, let's keep going. The box had traveled with Alina through 3 office moves and 2 different homes. She wiped a thin layer of dust from its lid before opening it. Inside were small, ordinary things that would have meant nothing to anyone else. An old motel key. A folded highway map with coffee stains along the edges. A small compass that no longer pointed north the way it used to. And tucked beneath all of it, inside a yellowed envelope, was a receipt from a small roadside garage. The ink had faded almost to nothing, but she could still make out the name printed at the top, Reyes Family Auto Repair. She leaned back in her chair and let her mind travel backward, almost 2 decades, to a version of herself that most people who knew her now would never recognize. 20 years ago, Alina hadn't been a CEO. She had been 26 years old, driving a car that rattled more than it ran, trying desperately to keep a small construction supply business from collapsing after her only investor pulled out at the worst possible moment. On a stormy night, driving to meet the one client who could have saved her company, her car had broken down on a narrow road outside of town. The nearest garage was already closing for the night. A man named Elias Reyes had seen her standing in the rain, hood up, staring helplessly at an engine she didn't understand. He hadn't hesitated. He reopened the shop, worked through the storm, and had her back on the road within the hour. When it came time to pay, Alina had barely enough to cover half the bill. She remembered apologizing, promising to send the rest the following week. Elias had simply smiled and waved a hand. "Go make your meeting," he had told her. "Pay me when life slows down a little." Life never did slow down. Within months, her business landed a contract that changed everything, and from there it grew faster than she ever expected. She always meant to go back and pay what she owed, but by the time she returned to that stretch of road, the garage was closed and the building was empty. A neighbor told her the owner had fallen ill and the family had moved away to be closer to relatives. She mailed a check to the last address she had. It came back marked undeliverable. Eventually, the memory faded beneath years of meetings, mergers, and responsibilities that never seemed to end. Until this morning, when a single name on a job application pulled it all back to the surface. She looked again at the emergency contact listed on Daniel's form. Elias Reyes. Same name. Her chest tightened. She pressed the intercom button on her desk. "Can you schedule Mr. Reyes for a meeting tomorrow morning?" Not another interview. Just a conversation. The next morning, Daniel almost didn't answer the call because the number looked unfamiliar. "This is Daniel." "Good morning, Mr. Reyes. This is Harmon Group. Ms. Cross would like to meet with you today if you're available." He frowned. "I'm sorry, did you say Ms. Cross?" "The CEO?" "That's correct. There must be some kind of mistake." "There isn't," the voice said gently. "Would 10 o'clock work for you?" "I'll be there," Daniel said, though his mind was racing with questions he couldn't begin to answer. He hung up and stood quietly in the kitchen. Mia looked up from her cereal bowl. "Good news." "I honestly don't know," he admitted. When Daniel arrived at the building later that morning, the top floor felt like an entirely different world from the lobby below. Thick carpet swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Glass walls reflected soft morning light pouring in from the harbor. An assistant greeted him warmly and led him toward a large office at the end of the hall. "Ms. Cross will see you now." He stepped inside. The office was bigger than his entire apartment, but the woman standing behind the desk didn't look intimidating at all. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You must be Daniel Reyes," she said. "Thank you for coming." She motioned toward a chair. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Your father?" she finally asked. "Is his name Elias?" Daniel nodded slowly. "It is." "Have we met before?" "No," Alina said, a small sad smile crossing her face. "But your father helped me once, a long time ago, before either of us could have imagined ending up here." She told him the story slowly, without exaggeration, exactly as she remembered it. When she finished, Daniel let out a quiet breath. "That sounds exactly like him," he said. "He's not doing great these days. Heart trouble, good days and bad days." "I'm sorry to hear that." "He still tries to fix neighbors' lawnmowers," Daniel added, smiling faintly. "Even though everyone tells him to slow down." For a brief moment, both of them laughed, and it eased the tension in the room. Alina reached into a drawer and placed the old, faded receipt gently on the desk between them. "I've held onto this for almost 20 years, she said. "I owe your father far more than what's written on this piece of paper." Daniel looked at the receipt, then back up at her. "You don't owe us anything. My father never helped people expecting something in return." Those words settled in the room longer than either of them expected. Alina understood something in that instant. If she simply handed Daniel a job because of an old debt, she would be turning his father's kindness into nothing more than a transaction, and that wasn't the kind of man Elias Reyes had ever been. She slid the receipt carefully back into its envelope. "I won't insult either of you by pretending sentiment should replace qualifications," she said. "So let's talk about your actual work history." Daniel blinked, surprised by the shift. "My work history is on the application." "I read it myself," Alina said. "You've supervised maintenance crews, trained new employees, managed electrical and plumbing systems in buildings far larger than what most people ever deal with. Why apply for a janitorial position?" "Because that's where the opening was," Daniel answered simply. "And because I needed the work." "I respect that answer," she said, and meant it. Rather than ending the meeting there, Alina invited the facilities director and the head of operations to join them. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, covering building systems, safety procedures, training programs, and long-term maintenance planning. Daniel spoke naturally because it was work he had spent his entire adult life mastering. At one point, the operations manager leaned forward. "We've been trying to solve a ventilation problem in the East Tower for months," he said. "Nothing's worked." Daniel thought for a moment. "It's probably not an equipment issue. Sounds more like a scheduling problem with the maintenance rotation." The manager scribbled notes furiously. Alina watched quietly from across the room. She wasn't looking at a janitorial applicant anymore. She was looking at a man who had nearly stopped trusting his own experience simply because unemployment had pushed him toward whatever job might keep food on the table for his daughter. When the meeting ended, Alina stood. "I don't think the janitorial position is the right fit for you," she said. Daniel's stomach dropped slightly, and he forced a polite smile. "I understand." "I wasn't finished," she said, handing him a folder. "We have an opening for assistant regional maintenance supervisor. It pays significantly more, includes full benefits starting immediately, and requires exactly the kind of experience you've spent years building." Daniel stared at the folder without opening it. "I didn't apply for this position." "No," Alina said. "You didn't. But I know enough about your work to offer you an interview for it anyway." For a long moment, Daniel simply sat there. Not because he was overwhelmed by the offer itself, but because after weeks of being turned away, it felt unfamiliar to have someone actually see what he was capable of, instead of only seeing the job title written on a form. He finally asked the question sitting heavy in his chest. "Are you offering this because of my father?" Alina thought carefully before answering. "I'm offering it because you're qualified," she said. "And because your father once reminded me, without ever saying it directly, to look at the person standing in front of me before judging their situation. That lesson mattered more than you know." That answer allowed Daniel to accept the opportunity without feeling like he was receiving charity instead of respect. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is about to hit even harder. Do me a quick favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who could use a reminder that good things can still happen. Let's finish this story together. Several weeks later, the company held a family day for employees. Mia wandered through the maintenance workshop wearing an oversized pair of safety glasses while Daniel introduced her to co-workers who had quickly become like a second family. Near the end of the afternoon, Alina happened to walk by. Mia thanked her politely for giving her father a job. Alina smiled warmly. "I think your father earned that all on his own." Mia reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made you something." It was a simple drawing. A small repair garage on one side, a tall glass office building on the other, and two figures shaking hands in the middle. Above the picture, written in careful, uneven handwriting, were the words, "Kindness travels farther than we think." Alina asked if she could keep it. Mia nodded happily. A week later, Alina had it framed and placed on a bookshelf near her desk, instead of hiding it away behind paperwork. Whenever visitors asked about the child's drawing, she always gave the same simple answer. "It reminds me not to overlook ordinary people." Months passed, and Daniel settled naturally into his new role. He wasn't perfect. He occasionally misjudged a schedule or forgot a small detail here and there. Once, he accidentally ordered the wrong replacement parts for an entire building. But instead of hiding the mistake, he admitted it immediately and worked with his team to fix it. The people working under him respected that kind of honesty more than they would have respected perfection. His father, Elias, slowly regained enough strength to visit one of the company's buildings for the first time. He insisted on bringing homemade cookies for the maintenance crew because, as he liked to say, people work better after a decent snack. Nobody argued with him. One quiet afternoon, Alina finally met Elias in person. He had no idea who she was until she mentioned a stormy night from 20 years earlier. Recognition slowly spread across his face, followed by the same calm smile she remembered from that rainy evening. "I always figured things worked out for you," he said. "They did," Alina replied. "Because of you." "I'm glad," he said simply. There was no dramatic speech, no grand reunion scene, just two people sharing a quiet cup of coffee while watching workers plant new flowers outside the building. It felt complete in a way that words couldn't fully explain. Before leaving that day, Elias glanced toward Daniel, who was laughing with his crew across the yard. "You know," he said softly. "He almost didn't apply here. Too much pride, I think, for a while." "I'm glad he did," Alina said. "So am I," Elias replied. "Sometimes life doesn't reward kindness right away. Sometimes it waits patiently, quietly, for years, before circling back in a way nobody could have predicted. Not as a debt being repaid, but as a simple reminder to notice the people who are too often overlooked." Daniel never once believed his story was extraordinary. He believed he was simply a father trying to provide for his daughter during a hard season of life. He believed in showing up, telling the truth, and doing honest work, even when that work wasn't the work he had originally planned for himself. He never expected recognition. He never expected a second chance to walk through the door disguised as a janitorial application. But that's often how life works. The turning points rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive quietly, folded into ordinary moments, hidden inside a name on a piece of paper, a small act of kindness offered years earlier, a decision to help someone even when there was nothing to gain from it. Elias Reyes never once expected repayment for helping a stranger stranded in the rain. He fixed her car because it was the right thing to do, not because he imagined it would someday come back to change his son's life. That is the quiet, powerful truth sitting at the center of this story. Kindness rarely disappears completely. It waits. It travels. And sometimes, it finds its way back exactly when it's needed the most. If this story reminded you that good things can still happen to good people, let this be your sign to keep showing up, keep working honestly, and keep being kind, even when nobody is watching and nobody seems to notice. You never know whose life you might quietly be shaping. Before you go, tell me in the comments. Do you believe kindness always finds its way back, even after 20 years? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched you even a little, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next story.